Hello everyone, thank you for joining our seminar about biasness and misinformation in pop culture. I'm Karen, I'm the person hosting the seminar on par with MediaCheck, is a nonprofit organization. We have a guest speaker today, Anne Haley, who's a retired journalist, and she's going to be talking about on a journalist side of misinformation, so I'll let her. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. It's great to be here. Thanks to everybody for coming today on your Saturday. As Karen mentioned, I'm a retired journalist. I retired about 3 years ago, and I was first a reporter for several years and then a newspaper editor for a total of 42 years. The last 10 years I was a digital editor in charge of the news portion of news organizations' websites and their social media accounts. So we're going to talk today. They asked me to talk today about how to spot bias in news and how to look for it, how to analyze it, think critically about it. So the first thing to know really is that there's bias in everything. We're all biased one way or another. In addition to the obvious biases like racial and ethnic and religious ones, we could be biased against or toward people that we might think are too fat or too thin or too old or too young, or who dress or who act a certain way. The important thing to know is that people don't realize that they're biased. People tend to have friends and relatives who are like they are, and people filter information through their personal biases, either consciously or subconsciously, and they tend to believe information that favors their biases. And this tendency to believe information that favors your own biases is called confirmation bias. We all do that, and it takes work not to do this. Journalists are trained to set aside their own biases as much as they possibly can in order to report as fairly and impartially as possible. It's a form of compartmentalizing, putting things in boxes and setting them aside. I might have my own opinions, but if I'm a reporter going out to report about what the school board is doing or report on a local rally, I have to set aside my personal opinions about whatever's going on so that I can go be the eyes and the ears of people who can't be there in person and tell them factually what is happening in front of me and what it is I see and what it is I hear without letting my personal opinions get in the way. And in the same sense of this, editors who write headlines for the stories that reporters write have to write headlines that are be interesting enough to make readers want to click on them and read the reports, but they also have to avoid their biases too. So it's a whole learned method of compartmentalizing and setting aside your biases. Even with all of this, biases can creep into news coverage, usually in the way a news organization treats a particular topic, especially politics, and in what a news organization decides to cover or not to cover. There are two well-known media bias charts that have analysts rate what they perceive to be the political organizations of major political leanings of major news organizations. And I'm going to screen share here so that I can share this with you. First of some of my many displays. So bear with me for a second here because this doesn't always work the way I want it to. Karen, is this displaying okay?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, so this is called the Adfontes Media chart. It's the interactive media bias chart. This is really well known by a group called Adfontes, ADFONTES. It's a Latin phrase. And along the left to right axis, it goes from partisan left through the middle or balanced to partisan right. And vertically, it goes from non-biased factual reporting through analysis in the media down to very unbiased. Let me scroll here, very unbiased and non-factual reporting. And if I scroll in a little bit, what you'll see is here in the top middle, which is what you want to know the most about, NPR News is probably the most balanced. The Associated Press, which is a cooperative news organization, the well-known AP and Reuters, another large news organization, those are also very middle of the road, very unbiased. You'll see Wall Street Journal over here a little bit to the right, ABC, PBS over here a little bit to the left. So this is a good chart to look at if you're looking to see where does a news organization's news reports usually fall. Los Angeles Times a little bit over to the left, other ones very much to the left. OAN is over here way to the right, Fox News middle right. So you can see those ones. Another media bias chart that is worth knowing about is called All Sides. This one is simpler. It is simply a list. And here again in the center, you see AP, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, NPR. This is leans right, this is right, and this is leans left and left. And allsides.com is this site. So those are two sites that you can go to see how a news organization might be perceived by analysts to lean in its news coverage. And again, this is news coverage, not opinion, news coverage. So people read articles through the lens of their personal biases too. This is another added layer. When I was an editor who managed newspapers' websites, I could post a news article that was a perfectly well-written, unbiased news article, as near as I could tell, right, as an editor. And within minutes, there'd be comment from some reader criticizing it as being biased toward the political right. And the next minute, there'd be somebody else criticizing it as being biased from the political left. And this would go on all day long. Whenever I'd tell people about this, they'd usually blow me off, sure that they were right and the article must have been biased somehow. So that's an example of people reading through their personal biases. And I've got an example here of, let's see, I'm sorry. Sorry about all this fumbling around. I actually have not done this with this many different screens. Here's an LA Times article that I wanted to show you guys that's an example of readers reading an article through their own biases. This is actually a very lengthy, well-written article about how more and more children are coming to hospitals with illnesses or injuries that are not COVID. Like, let's say they have, flu or some other kind of illness, bronchitis or something, and then they get tested and it turns out they have COVID. And there's been more and more of this. So the LA Times reporter used a children's hospital in San Diego and what was going on there as an example of this. They talked to the dad of this little girl here in the main photo, and he turned out to think that maybe this was kind of blown out of proportion. And he actually stated in the story that he's a viewer of Fox News, and he was kind of skeptical. So it's a lengthy article. I'll just scroll through kind of quickly because what I want to show you guys is down here. After all of this reporting about sick children and how sick they are and what kind of illnesses they come in with and what the doctors are finding and what's going on not only in San Diego but statewide, the very first comment from one of the readers down here at the bottom, somebody who uses the name Somaliuments, says that they're commenting about government and media starting to downplay the pandemic because of its political costs. So they think that there is something, nefarious going on here. And then the next comment is somebody who's replying to that person saying, well, there's all this and you're complaining that there's just a conspiracy of government and the media. This is science. What are you, nuts? And the third person comes in and says, wow, why are you complaining about this person who's questioning the whiplash we're all feeling? What's wrong with you? People are going back and forth and everybody's confused. And then yet another person comes in and says, complexity is just too much for all you people, essentially calling them stupid. So here's this entire article that's been about nothing but sick children. And yet the people who've read it through the lenses of their own opinions, their own biases, are arguing about politics essentially, and whether or not there's a government conspiracy. It's actually a good example of the kinds of things that happen with news media all day, but also of how people read through the lens of their own biases. Sometimes, though, articles can be deliberately biased. Deliberately biased information has been around since people were able to spread rumors and since they invented the printing press. Social media just lets biased information spread much faster and wider. Social media also lets anybody publish almost anything. People can twist facts, eliminate inconvenient and contrary facts, and just make stuff up. Depending on its intent, this is either misinformation, disinformation, or propaganda. Misinformation can be just a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. I've done it. From inexperience, lack of time, misunderstandings, or just being tired or careless. Disinformation and propaganda are deliberately false information designed to mislead people for a purpose, usually a social or political purpose or a financial purpose. 30 or so years ago, I was working as an editor at that time when social media was just starting. People were thinking, great, good information will be so much easier to get and to spread now through social media. But it also turned out that disinformation and misinformation were a lot easier to spread too. Social media's echo chamber amplifies the bad as well as the good. And if everybody's sharing something, it can seem like it must be true, but what's popular isn't always what's right. So if you don't want to accidentally spread misleading info or deliberately manipulative info, you're going to need to be skeptical and analytical and look at information critically in order to assess it. And let me present this slide here. The first thing you need to do to be able to tell what's reliable and what's deliberately biased info is to assess where information is coming from. Who wrote an article? Who created a video? Who produced it? So a news article should have a byline. A reporter's name is called a byline at the top of an article. If it's not at the top of an article, look at the bottom. There you usually find information about the reporter. In this instance, we have a headline up at the top, a photo, and then the reporter's byline, Heather McRae, with her email address, and she's from the Orange County Register, the date the story was originally written, and the date that it was most recently updated. And then I also wanted to show you guys that videos are a bit different. These are YouTube news videos. One of my sons was a TV news producer. He's now working at Fox Sports, but he pointed out that non-American, non-US news videos will include down at the bottom this little line down here that will tell you, based on usually Wikipedia, what the news source is. So the green logo here, this is RT, Russia Today, and it has the reporter's name next to it and her contact info. And then down here, based on Wikipedia, RT is funded in whole or in part by the Russian government. And if you look at the media bias charts, I think RT will be on there someplace on most of them. And it is a Russian government news organ. It's the successor to the old Soviet TASS news agency. It is not reliable. So there's that one. Here's another one that is not an American news organization. This is the BBC with their logo up in the corner. And again, not an American organization. So YouTube is telling us that BBC is a British public broadcasting service. This is American, and I'm sorry, it's got my name in the way, but oops. Underneath it, up here in the corner, it does say USA Today. It's American, so we don't have the Wikipedia tag on it. I want to show you guys this one because you have to look all over the place. This LA Times, Los Angeles Times logo down here is hard to see on the guy's light colored jacket. So you do have to look. But again, do research and know try to find out the source of the video. You want to truth check your article's information. So check your news bias charts that I showed you guys. Truth check it with Snopes.com and PolitiFact.com. They are two outfits that usually, for the most blatantly disinformation articles, will check them out and tell you what's really going on with them. And then Pointer, which is a journalism education organization has a media-wise fact-checking project at pointer.org/news/fact-checking. And that's also another good place to check. This is the basics of journalism. Any good article should answer these questions, the 5 W's and 1 H of journalism: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And they should answer these questions or so they don't know. The one time you're going to not see this is breaking news. If, for example, a celebrity has just crashed his car and TV news is just reporting it, they may know who, what, and where, but they may not know when, why, and how yet. But they'll get there. It's just that it's so early they don't know yet. You also want to know the source of an article's information. Google the person, the institution, or the other source cited to make sure it's real and credible. Know that people who are making up stuff and making up sources will make up real sounding names for stuff. Like they'll say that something is from the Journal Inquirer or the Telegram Reporter. And those are not, they sound real, but those are not real names of news organizations. So Google to find out what it is. Make sure it's real and credible. Be a little bit wary of Wikipedia. It's a good starting place, but basically anybody can become a Wikipedia articles editor. And sometimes people go in and deliberately mess with Wikipedia articles. So make sure you know that and go beyond Wikipedia in your Google searches if you're really concerned that an article is not what it appears to be. And I want to show you guys some examples of well-sourced articles. This is an Associated Press, or AP, as it's now known, article. And this is the kind of article that AP does really well. AP, I think I mentioned, is a consortium or a cooperative of news organizations that got together many, many years ago and funded an cooperative organization to hire reporters to cover things all over the country and then eventually all over the world in places where individual newspapers and news organizations couldn't have their own reporters. Worldwide organization, well respected. And this is the kind of thing that they do very well. It's breaking ongoing news over a wide area or region, especially when it's something they can anticipate and know that is going to happen, like the weather. So this was the blizzard last week that buffeted the East Coast with deep snow and winds and flooding. They've got everything here. They've answered all of our 5 W's and our 1 H. They've got quotes from people in positions of authority. They've got a quote from a regular guy who was driving a snow dump truck. There's really good detail, like right here, the wind scoured the ground bare in some spots and piled the snow into huge drifts in others. They have people in cities all up and down the eastern coast. They've got lots of good information like snowfall amounts, air, train, and highway traffic conditions and closures, states of emergency. They go into the climate effect and how a blizzard is defined, when it was all expected to end. They've got this all packed into a really tightly written, very factual and straightforward article. They've packed a lot of information into a fairly long article. One thing I wanted to show you is that down at the bottom, in what is known as a tagline at the end of the story, they tell you not only where the lead reporter who had the byline, Catalini, was reporting from, but they also tell you which other reporters contributed to the article and where they were located at the time that they were contributing to the article, so that you have transparency and you know who was reporting on what and from where. So that's a kind of what's known as a straight news story. They were reporting on something factual happening. This one's a little bit more fun, but it's also a good example of a well-sourced article. Fake poop helps evicted owls settle into a new neighborhood. This cute little guy here, this owl, is a burrowing owl, and they dig burrows or holes in the ground in owl neighborhoods. in Southern California, among other places. But they're threatened species now. They're getting driven out because of development. And scientists and environmentalists are trying to help relocate them, but they have to trick them because these owls like to be in their own little communities, and they have to make them feel like it's good to move to this other place. So to do that, they've discovered that they can use white paint to look like bird poop and paint it and make it look like bird poop. Then the owls think, oh, other owls have been here. Look, there's owl poop. And so they'll move in. It's a cute story. It's based on the results of a pilot program that was released in a scientific journal that studies birds and owls, but it doesn't rely only on the scientific journal study. They also talked to 2 other experts who did not participate in the study, and they specifically identify those 2 experts that way in the story. And I also wanted you guys to notice, let's see, up here is our reporter's name, right? The byline. But I wanted you guys to notice that down at the end in the tagline, they also have an interesting kind of transparency. The Associated Press Health and Science Department receives support from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education. The AP is solely responsible for all content. So what this means is that the AP gets money, probably a grant, from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, but the Howard Hughes Medical Institute does not tell the AP what to report and how to report it. The AP decides that. So this is them, the AP, being very transparent. And now we've got an example of a badly sourced article. This is from the Daily Beast. Nils Lofgren cuts ties with Spotify over, quote, lies and misinformation. Anytime you see a quote in a headline like this, headline writing standards in journalism should be that this quote is in the article someplace, that somebody actually said this. And the implication here is that Nils Lofgren said this. So we're going to find out. Did he? This is a very short article. And there's just not a lot of information here. There's no clear explanation of what rock and roll legends Neil Young and Joni Mitchell did, although there is a link here and here to some background information. But the thing is, in my experience as a digital editor, most people are not going to click through. They're not going to go to the trouble. They're just going to read what's in front of them. So a sentence or two could give the background information or summarize it rather than relying on people to click through, which they're really not going to do. There's no response from Spotify or Joe Rogan, so nobody attempted to get the other side. There's not even a no comment from them. This whole article, and this is the extent of the entire thing right here on the screen. This is more of an extended Nils Lofgren press release than it is a news article. The problem here that I showed you with the headline is that those words are nowhere in the quote, are nowhere in this article. It is, if you were to click through, in Nils Lofgren's extended statement that he released, it is in there. But this really does not meet journalism standards. That quote should be here in this article somewhere. The other problem here is that it's got loaded wording. It uses the words called out Spotify's role in enabling COVID-19 misinformation. That's very judgmental wording. It really should be worded more neutrally as stating objected to Spotify's role in repeating COVID-19 misinformation or platforming misinformation. So that is an example of one that is not so good. Now, we've also got some examples of both left-leaning and a right-leaning news organizations writing about the same subject. And this is interesting because 2 reporters attended the same Trump rally in Conroe, Texas on January 29th and wrote articles where you would think that these 2 reporters were not even at the same rally from the stories they wrote. The first one is from the Washington Examiner. And if you looked at the media bias chart, you would find the Washington Examiner would be somewhat to the right of center. The second one will be from the Washington Post, which is usually rated somewhere to the left of center. So this is the Washington Examiner, and the headline on it is Trump touts borders at home and abroad during Texas rally. And the reporter talks about Donald Trump appearing at the rally and discussing the US border, criticizing the Biden administration about its border policies. He also talks about other borders, the Ukraine border, China's border, Russia, the Winter Olympics, but just borders in general. It's not a very long story. Then we have the Washington Post article. And the headline, Trump suggests that if he is reelected, he will pardon January 6th Capitol rioters. This is a somewhat longer story. Again, the Conroe, Texas rally, same date. Former President Trump suggested he will pardon rioters charged in connection with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol if he is elected president in 2024. And this is all about Donald Trump's statements at the rally about what he might do regarding the Capitol insurrection and anyone connected with it, and his plans to perhaps run for re-election. What's interesting here, besides the fact that these are two completely different articles, is you would think that there might be some overlap. Politicians do go to rallies, particularly campaign rallies, and they do talk about more than one subject. They usually have 2 or 3 policies that they want to touch on. So it is possible for 2 different reporters to go to the same rally and write about 2 different policies, but you would expect that there would be some overlap, that there would be a sentence like Trump also criticized Biden's border policies in one of them, and Trump also suggested that he would help January 6th Capitol rally attendees facing legal cases in the other. But there's nothing, there's absolutely no overlap whatsoever. So it's like they just completely went to different things. The Washington Post article, interestingly, mentions that Trump was impeached twice, which is related to their focus. So that's a legitimate thing to mention. And in contrast, the Washington Examiner article never even mentions that Trump hinted that he might run again. And what he actually was quoted as saying was, if I run and I win. So he apparently did mention that. So that one is interesting in that it is so completely different. So I hope that I've been able to answer some, talk to you about a little bit about how you can go about learning about how to spot media bias. And if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
There is a question that was sent in, which is, how do you think this affects society as a whole?
Since I've retired, I've been doing some community volunteer work, and one of the things I'm really concerned about is how the decline in local news reporting and the increase in social media, and how that affects things like local elections, local politics, people's participation in society. I know a lot of people who want to, they get scared off from social media. They find it very divisive. So they want to drop out of the social discourse, for example. They decide they don't trust media because there's so much back and forth and social discourse about it, and it's hard for them to filter it out, hard to sort it out. So I think that because initially what we expected was that social media would be a very positive thing, and it's turned out to be really divisive, I think, and hard for people to sort out, very hard for people to sort out if they don't have tools to sort it out. So I think that the way it affects the society is to add to a lot of people's confusion and make it harder for people to know what to do, to know how to interpret articles. I know when I'm on Facebook with a lot of my friends my age, they'll post articles and I can tell immediately by looking, because of my background, well, that's, not from a good source and it's not true. And I can immediately show them why it isn't. But, they've been misled by it. They've been essentially fooled. But it's hard for them to sort out. So there's a lot of negative effects. Did that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. If no one has any other questions, I'd like to say thank you for speaking today.
Sure.
The sources that Anne has mentioned, PolitiFact, Snoops, and both media charts can actually be found on MediaCheck's website in our resources page. We have links to all of these different sources and charts if anyone needs to use them later on. So yeah. That being said, I'll kind of continue on with the seminar on my end. So I wanted to talk about more on the social media and pop culture aspect of this entire thing. I think and went over really well on how biasness works as a whole. Media bias, according to Google, is the bias of journalists and news producers within mass media and selection of many events and stories that are reported on how they are covered. And essentially, biasness is not really something that we can avoid. Everyone has biasness because everyone has lived different lives, and that kind of shapes how they think. And whether we can acknowledge it or whether or not we like it, biasness is always directly affected in someone's writing, whether or not we believe it to be true or whether or not we actually are able to identify it. So biases is something that can't be avoided, but in some cases, it's a lot clearer that biasness exists than others. One example is this on the New York Times, where you have a very clear left-leaning biasness, which can be seen through the Hillary Clinton ad that says "I'm with her." It very clearly is left-leaning because obviously Hillary Clinton was a Democratic candidate at the time, and the New York Times is widely known to be a left-leaning news media outlet. So sometimes biasness is very obvious, but sometimes biasness is also not as obvious, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about. So that being said, biasness comes in many different sources. It can come from social media, parents, friends, and surroundings. I have recently, my French teacher had actually during class said that she believed jellyfish not to be animals because that's what her husband had told her. And she believed that because she trusted her husband. And that kind of, not necessarily biasness, but it shows how people can be affected by others that are around them, especially those who they trust. With social media, I think it's very given, it's a given that biasness would spread because the people you follow, either your friends or influencers, are people who will either share the same mindset as you or people who you look up to. It shapes how you think as a whole. I think with parents, it's also very obvious. Parents and family, you live with them on a daily basis. So obviously that's who's going to affect you and how you think. My biggest influence in bias would most likely be my brother in that sense, because I live with him on a daily basis and I trust his opinion. So it kind of relies on how it's being shared, because there's different ways to create a narrative, and we'll kind of get into that. But another aspect of it is it can be directly broadcasted by so yeah. I think news often gets distorted to match a narrative, and we'll kind of talk about that, I believe, in the next slide, where we talk about how news is actually spread in biasness. It gets very distorted, and as it gets passed down, it gets warped as a person writing it will change it little by little. And then an example we'll have later on. But it's also how it's kind of, and I think talked about this a lot, but so I'm not going to talk about too much, but it's basically like biasness is put in little by little. Either it goes from something that is very reliable to something that is not as reliable as time goes on and as it goes to different people. It's very similar to the game Telephone, where you say one thing and then everyone whispers it, and then 10 people later it's completely something different. So what I have actually is a clip of the Avengers playing Telephone on Jimmy Kimmel to kind of show how spreading bias and how news can actually become biased and warped. So we're just going to watch this clip really quickly.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Kimmel. We have such a big show for you tonight. You're not even going to believe it. So many stars are here tonight. But first, we're going to play a simple game of telephone to get things going, okay? Here we go. The Avengers are on the show tonight.
I have a rash. Can I thank you?
Oh, gosh. I don't want to say that.
The diaphragm jelly is in my glove box? How'd we do? Very bad.
So basically, I think it is very clear. So they went from the Avengers on the show tonight to the diaphragm jelly is in my glove box, which are two completely different things. But what ended up happening in this scenario is what actually happens in real life a lot, where one thing is said and then it goes through 10 or so different people, change little by little to be something completely different. And that's essentially how biasness spreads, how misinformation spreads from like facts, from facts to misinformation. That's kind of how it all goes down. So that being said, then there is pop culture misinformation. How does misinformation retain to pop culture and on social media? So a lot of this actually has relation to social media, such as Instagram, on Twitter, influencers, YouTubers, people who are very prominent on social media platforms, especially people who influence teenagers and Gen Z and millennials because of the mass online presence. So some examples of influencers actually going and spreading misinformation, whether or not that was on purpose or not on purpose, would be on COVID-19. Kanye's anti-vax stance has a lot more publicity. In July of 2020, even before the vaccine came out, rapper Kanye West told Forbes that he believed the coronavirus vaccine could put chips inside of us, which obviously is a big conspiracy in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine, but also during that time, people who during a pandemic like this, even when the vaccine wasn't out, spreading that misinformation is things that are extremely not hurt. Nicki Minaj had also cautioned vaccine, which increased mass COVID skepticism during this time. Another example would be a Bollywood movie star by the name of Amitabh Bachchan repeatedly shared false information regarding COVID to his, at the time, 45 million followers across various different platforms. And the real question is, like, why is this important? And this is primarily important because people believe these influencers, or at least they want to believe these influencers. It kind of it relates to how biasness affects people. These are, in a sense, people who they look up to, parasocial relationships in a sense as well. But it's because they watch these people or they listen to these people on a daily basis that they'll naturally be more inclined to believe what they are saying. And that's kind of how influencers, in a sense, actually do relate greatly to misinformation, and on a pop culture section on why they are in pop culture, why there is mass misinformation. But that doesn't just relate to political or things like COVID-19. There's also mass stigmatism in other examples of biasness. One of them is Twitter drama. An example would be like mass divisions in the Minecraft YouTube community, that kind of relates to toxicity of fans online, and it creates stigmatization of different fandoms depending on which fandom you're in or which fandom you like kind of listen to on either Twitter and Instagram, etc. But these like online fandoms, depending, has like media bias, has biasness, not necessarily media bias, but there are also misinformation surrounding based off of maybe one or two people, which creates stigmatism of mass fandoms and online communities. Another example of this would be like trends on TikTok, which are completely fake. Things are like play the sound, or can you believe this, or maybe like 5-minute crafts, things like those that aren't necessarily true, but they get a lot of views. And that's why people post them. Even though they know it's fake, they post them because they know it'll go viral and they know that it'll get views. And there's also this thing on TikTok, like factor cap, where people actually try looking at whether or not they're real or fake. But the fact that this in and of itself has to exist shows how on a pop culture and social media base, especially on things like a TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, is very prevalent because of things like this. And then another great example of not necessarily biasness in news, but how misinformation and how people perceive different forms of information and different things affects how they behave are NFTs. Because let's be honest, no one knows what an NFT is, but they're really, really prevalent. Because what are NFTs in a sense? And in my opinion, I can't give the full answer, but I can tell you that NFTs are basically these. They're non-fungible tokens in a digital space, but they're also just kind of pictures online. And the one on the right, the pixelated one, sold for $69 million. It's a large amount of money, and this phenomenon is now called kind of NFT mania, which actually can relate similarly. The reason why these things are so prevalent is kind of, it relies on some misinformation on NFTs. People believe that they are valuable even if they're not valuable, so they'll pay large amounts of money to buy them because of this biasness and because of misinformation around them. It's very similar to what happened around the 1600s in Holland and Amsterdam, called tulip mania, where the price of tulip buds, which now can be bought for about 50 cents, were estimated to sell for $750 each. $750,000 each, not 750. It's a large amount of money for something that doesn't essentially isn't worth that much money. But the reason why they sell for that much money is because of this craze, because of trends, and because of like the information is very confusing and a lot of misinformation and bias in order for people to be able to buy these things. The one that sold for $69 million, I think a 9-year-old could do. I think there has been reports of people who are children selling NFTs to make millions of dollars, and that's primarily because of things on pop culture, and not necessarily pop culture, but like misinformation surrounding NFTs. But they're not necessarily that valuable. It's just a picture, and it doesn't really mean anything in that sense. So that's kind of like on a pop culture spectrum of things. And there's also in pop culture a lot of political misinformation. We can't ignore the fact that there is political misinformation, even if we wanted to, because in the day and age we live in, everything has become something political. And a great example that I want to talk about how one source can turn into two completely different things is the example of this photo, which is they're the exact same picture and the exact same article, but they have two completely different meanings because of the biasness that they have. One of them says, from the Liberal Society, White House finally gives Kelly Conaway the boot. Are you glad? And then the other one says, White House just gave Conaway the boot, prepared to be infuriated. These obviously have media bias in them that you can very clearly tell in the title because of the fact that it's telling you what you should feel. And because of this, it kind of indicates how the reader should be thinking, and it clearly shows the biasness of the article itself. You can tell because one of them is from the Liberal Society, another one is from Conservative 101. But even if you don't look at that, you can, it's very clear that they are the same, they're saying the same thing in the articles, but they have that clear connotation of biasness in them. And that's kind of what is prevalent, because in the role of their media, most people get their understanding of politics through, especially now in this digital age, through social media and through things like of Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc. And the news directly affects what you think, because what you read is what you believe in. And because of this pop culture and social media and why everything is online, it's more prevalent, because especially since teens have a short attention span, because we don't often look at the full story. Sometimes we'll just read headlines, sometimes we'll skim through passages, things like that. But on social media, it is just a quick photo and a quick description that doesn't give the whole story, but that is essentially what it is. Fake and biased news causes people to be more susceptible to other fake and biased news, which creates a loop that is very difficult to get out of. And that's kind of what we're trying to get out of now. And that's kind of how, and on that note, there's also a section where it's like how misinformation spreads. And that is primarily because of, I guess, or two things. The first one is chain posting, where one person posts something and then it gets reshared and then gets reshared and reshared and reshared and reshared constantly. It's not necessarily always a bad thing, but you always have to be aware that the information that's being shared constantly isn't always information that's true. Reports from MIT have shown that misinformation is significantly more likely to be reposted and reshared than information that contains more factual information. Another is bias by lack of information, and I kind of touched upon this, but it's because posts don't tell the full story. They just have what you want to hear, and people who don't necessarily want to do that own research will just look at that and they'll be like, oh, okay, and move on. They're not going to do their own research. So that lack of information will actually cause biasness and cause misinformation to spread even more, because maybe you read something that's not the whole story, you find it interesting, and you tell your friend, they tell their friends, and then 50 people believe the story that doesn't give the whole story, it just gives a part, and then essentially spreading misinformation. So then we kind of come to the point where, like, how do we solve? What do we do about this problem that's so prevalent and so big in our world? And how can we solve it in order to create a world where less misinformation is spread and there is more factual information, less stigmatism, less toxicity? And the real answer to this essentially is we can't actually solve the problem. It's really big. As of like right now, it's one person or two people doing anything can't solve a bigger problem that is one of the biggest phenomenons in the world. But what we can do is protect ourselves, and kind of went over how to spot misinformation. So I'm going to go over it very briefly again, but there are a few main points to notice. Is to use trusted sources. Again, the ad fonts and all slide charts are great places to look for a great place to look for different sources that are very trustworthy and non-biased. You also have to think twice before you repost anything. If you look at something and it does seem a little bit off, you do genuinely want to make sure that you do a little bit of research before you repost it, or even or like kind of just make sure you look at trusted sources. Another thing is to be aware, because one of the things that kind of simulates misinformation and why a lot of people are more prone to look at it is because it aligns with their beliefs in most points. But the inaccurate information does not necessarily always align with someone's beliefs, which is why we have to be more aware in that sense. If we are more aware of what we're learning and what we're reading, and it doesn't always agree with us, but it's what mostly is online and what is mostly there, then that is, whether or not we like it, the information that is most accurate. We shouldn't just be going to find sources that are necessarily fake, or sources that are like a needle in a haystack just to prove our point. it is a small steps to help keep everyone safe in this scenario, because there are real world consequences of misinformation that leads to more partisanship and mass stigmatization online, in a sense. So that's kind of a few things that you could do to help yourself, or help friends if you wanted to talk to them about it as well. If they ever post misinformation, just don't repost it, and then talk to them about it, in a sense. So overall, just a brief, like, I guess, overview of everything that's been talked about in this is that misinformation is everywhere. It's being spread not just through on a political spectrum, but also on a pop culture spectrum in social media, online, on influencers. And because of that, we have to be more careful. We should be more careful, be aware. Don't kind of just give in to popular trends. Always just do a little bit of extra research, 5 to 10 minutes, and just to be aware overall in order to protect yourself and help kind of not read misinformation, in a sense. So yeah, thank you for joining and listening. A little bit about MediaCheck before you go. MediaCheck is a 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on fighting misinformation with education. We have interviews, articles, and a mass social media presence all on our website. We're also looking for volunteers on education, publicity, and journalism. So if you know anyone who needs volunteering or you're interested, it is all on our website, MediaCheckNonprofit.com. That being said, thank you for listening. And I actually do have a survey. I was wondering if everyone could fill out. It's just a little bit of this seminar, anything you've learned, etc. And that being said, thank you for joining.